Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to take a look at a chapter written by Martha Nussbaum, and the chapter is called Immortals, Lucretius on Death and the Voice of Nature. So Immortals, and it's from the book The Therapy of Desire. Now this article looks at the ideas of mortality and immortality and fits into a series of videos I've been making, where we first talked about Thomas Nagel's article Death, then Bernard Williams's article on the tedium of immortality, and then a short story by the literary author Borges called The Immortal. Now Nussbaum is going to take her inspiration from Lucretius, the Roman poet who writes about the philosophy of Epicureanism. And so it's Lucretius, but also Epicurus, who is his main source of ideas. And Lucretius and Epicurus are going to try to cure us of the fear of death. And so that's going to be the main theme here, right? The fear of death. Is that something that hampers us? Is it something of which we need to be cured? And if so, how can we be cured of it? And the ideas of mortality and immortality, and whether we should understand ourselves as mortals or maybe in some sense as immortals, is going to be central to Nussbaum's story. So, here is something that might happen to you, Nussbaum basically tells us through a fictional example. You're walking around, you're enjoying nature, you're also very keenly aware of the transience of these experiences. Like the fact that they are going to change, that they are going to be over at some point. Right? You see this beautiful spring, but you know that one day it's going to be winter again. What's more, you know that you yourself will die and not see another spring. Maybe you have a relative who is right now very ill and you are worried that they will never see another spring again. And maybe you are even reminded of your childhood, which is now forever gone, or you are reminded of people you loved who are no longer here because they are dead or something happened to them or whatever. So you are enjoying your life and the beauty of nature and so on and so forth, but it's tinged with sadness, the sense of loss, both past and inevitably in the future. Now, a thought that you might have at that point is, I don't want to be at the mercy of the fear of death anymore. If that's your thought, then Lucretius, this Epicurean poet, is going to come along and say, you're right, and I'm going to cure you. So, let's look at Lucretius. The first thing Nussbaum tells us about Lucretius is that he has kind of two projects that he presents as being part of the same project. And Nussbaum is going to argue that they are in a very big tension with each other and that you can't try to do both. On the one hand, Lucretius is going to claim to make us equal to the gods. On the other hand, he is going to claim that he will teach us to follow nature. Now, these ideas, being equal to the gods and following nature, will in the course of the chapter turn out to be sort of taking up a kind of immortality and transcending our mortality, or embracing mortality. And for Nussbaum, these are two completely different projects, only one of which probably we can really engage in. Well, I don't think she says categorically that you can't try to become like the gods, but she definitely comes out on the side of embracing our mortality. And so we're going to see how that plays out. But let's start with Lucretius and his diagnosis of what is wrong with the human condition. Well, multiple things are wrong probably, but one very important thing that is wrong is that we have this fear of death. And Lucretius thinks that we shouldn't fear death. There's no reason to fear death, so we are in that sense wrong to fear death. But he also thinks that this fear of death is a kind of poison that really makes our lives much worse than they have to be. And this is not because I'm continually thinking, oh no, I fear death, oh no, I fear death. I mean, that can happen. But that's not the condition that most people are in. I mean, most people don't even think about their own deaths very often. Maybe we are very good at not thinking about our own deaths very often. Maybe we are even too good at not thinking about our own deaths very often. But certainly, when Lucretius tells us that the fear of death poisons our lives, what he means is that there's a sort of almost unconscious layer, maybe, at which the fear of death is doing its work and having an influence on us. And he points at a couple of ways in which this fear of death manifests itself. So one thing very important to the Epicureans, the fear of death drives us towards religion. So we spend our lives not caring about the here and now, about our lives and the world that we live in. We spend it instead worrying about the afterlife, worrying about what the gods think of us, whether they maybe are angry with us, trying to placate them, trying to get them to do what we want, listening to the priests, who we thereby give a lot of power over us, engaging in useless sacrifices, even engaging maybe in morally bad acts. So Lucretius likes to talk about how Agamemnon, this is in the stories about the Trojan War, how Agamemnon sacrifices his own daughter in order to appease the gods. I mean, that's the kind of thing that religion makes you do, Epicurus is telling us, or Lucretius is telling us. Religion is bad for you, but you are only driven to it because you fear death, and you think that either religion is necessary to get a better afterlife, or religion is necessary to get you any kind of afterlife whatsoever, and so stop the fear of death. But also, and even more directly maybe, the fear of death just interferes with the enjoyment of the pleasures of life. Right? If I am not afraid of death, then I could just walk around in nature and enjoy its beauty without being tormented by the thought that, oh no, maybe this is the last time I'll see it, or I'm already getting old, or wow, like other people have died, and you know, all these sad thoughts that I told you about in the beginning. And fear of death actually forces us into all kinds of, let's say, restless activities which we engage in order to kind of escape from our mortal, finite condition. So I need to explain that a little bit more. Suppose that somebody is trying to amass a lot of wealth. Like a lot of wealth. Not just what he needs to live, but a lot of wealth. I mean, why is he doing that? Well, Epicurus would say, he is actually deep down afraid of death. Like he doesn't want to think about that. And so he is sort of putting all his energy into amassing this very concrete external stuff, having made himself believe that that is the point, right? That is the point of living, the wealth. And if you have the wealth, then you are successful. And he does this because he doesn't want to think about the fact that, you know, everything that is actually worth something is going to disappear at some point. He is going to die at some point. So it's very, in a sense, it's a very modern analysis, almost psychoanalysis that Lucretius is doing here, like in, I think, the 1st century BC. He is telling us that every person is trying really to sort of flee from their own self. We hate ourselves. We hate ourselves because it's mortal. We are afraid of that thought. We don't want to think that thought. And so we flee from ourselves into these external goods, which are just never going to be what we really need. Okay, so greed, the lust for power, ambition, and so on, all of that, according to Lucretius, has something to do with this often unconscious fear of death. In other words, the fear of death really poisons our lives. And if somebody asks, well, but is it really the fear of death that makes me do all these things? Then Lucretius would say, well, look, there are these moments of kind of truth and self-insight when people suddenly realize that, yes, they really are afraid to die. And they actually deep down realize that it wasn't really worth it to try to amass this power or wealth or whatever. Like in the face of death, it all loses its value. Deep down, you kind of know that. And there are these moments when people also see it and express it. So, that's the analysis. The analysis of what is wrong with us. Now, one could push against this Epicurean, Lucretian story by saying, but if life is valuable, then a fear of death, a fear of losing all that value, seems perfectly rational. Right? The fear of death seems perfectly rational. Life is valuable, I don't want to lose it, so I fear death. Well, that's where Lucretius and centuries behind him, like centuries earlier, Epicurus, are going to give us their arguments. Arguments that are supposed to show us that the fear of death is irrational. We should not fear death. Well, the classic Epicurean argument, like the really famous one, goes like this. It says, something is only bad for you if you experience it. Right? I mean, something can only be bad for you if you experience it. But there's no experience of death, and so death can't be bad for you. Right? I mean, death, they have a story about how people sort of think that after death they are still kind of there to experience how bad it is to be dead or something like that. Well, that doesn't make sense, they say. You're not there after death. I mean, you die, so you're no longer there, right? So, you're no longer there to experience anything, but something can only be bad if you experience it as bad, and you're not there to experience anything, so death can't be bad. If it isn't bad, you shouldn't fear it, right? Why should you fear something that isn't bad? So, that's the basic argument, and we're going to look at some responses to that argument in a moment. But Nussbaum points out that Lucretius actually gives 3 other arguments, kind of supplementary arguments, which are importantly different. So let's run through them quickly. The first supplementary argument, so the second argument, is the one about the asymmetry between birth and death. So what Lucretius points out is that people really fear not existing after death, but they don't at all fear not existing before birth. Right? Nobody thinks with terror about all the ages before their birth when they didn't exist. And Lucretius says, look, I mean, clearly non-existence isn't bad, right? Just think about the time before your birth. So you should take the same attitude to non-existence after death. Argument number 3 is a kind of story told in this case in the poem of Lucretius, told by nature. And nature likens life to a banquet, right? A meal with several courses. And nature says, a banquet, it has a certain structure, right? You have appetizers and then maybe, I don't know, today we would say you have a soup and maybe a main course and dessert and coffee or tea at the end. And then it's been fine. Right? I mean, after you're there in the restaurant, you've drunk your cup of coffee or your tea, maybe eaten a little chocolate with it, and if then the cook comes and brings you another steak, you're not happy. I mean, that's not what you want. So there's just a kind of natural end point to this enjoyment. It's good that the banquet ends when it ends, and Epicurus or Lucretius or nature seems to suggest that's also so with life. Right? It can just be good. You can just be at the end of what was like the internal structure of your life, and now it's okay that it ends. Final argument is one where Lucretius points out that if people were immortal, the earth would become very full. In fact, it will become extremely full because nobody is dying, and if people keep being born, there's not room enough for everyone. So maybe people don't keep being born, but then we're just being super selfish, right? I mean, if we keep ourselves alive in such a way that there's no room for new people to be born, we're just being extremely selfish and immoral. So again, that's a reason to sort of embrace death as a natural and important part of life and existence. Okay, we're going to focus mostly on the first argument, the classic one. Death is bad for you only if you experience it as bad, but you can't experience death, so it can't be bad for you, so you shouldn't fear it. We actually saw some answers to that already, and Nussbaum talks about those answers. So she first talks about Thomas Nagel's answer. And Nagel said, well, look, it's not about awareness. Something can happen outside of your life or outside of your awareness and still be bad for you. If you are being laughed at behind your back by your friends or supposed friends, that's bad for you, even if you never find out. If somebody destroys your legacy after you die, that's bad for you, even though you're dead and you never find out. And if that's true, well, why couldn't dying, like losing all these nice, valuable things in life, also be bad for you, even if it happens, well, in a sense, after you live and you're never aware of it? And Nussbaum doesn't disagree with this, but she thinks it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't explain everything. It doesn't really explain how these lives get diminished, for instance, by things that are not, like, that we're not aware of. We want to hear more. Okay, Williams tries to give us more. Bernard Williams tells us that we have desires for the future. And if we die, then those desires are frustrated. Right? We're not going to get what we desire. I desire to see another summer. I desire to see my kids grow up. I desire to finish the book I'm writing. About the philosophy of infinity, by the way. I desire all those things, and if I die, I'm not getting them, and so my desires get frustrated, and that is bad for me. And again, Nussbaum doesn't quite disagree, but she thinks it doesn't work as an argument against Lucretius, or the Epicureans in general, because Lucretius and the Epicureans in general would say that those desires are not good. You should get rid of those desires. You shouldn't have any future-looking desires. And so if Williams says, well, I have those desires, and so death seems bad, they would say, yeah, death seems bad to you, but that's because you got the wrong desires. And we'll hear a bit more about that in a moment. But that's going to be important, right? What kind of desire should we have? Should we have desires that are future-looking, or should we sort of live in the moment and be completely happy because of what is going on right now without worrying about the future? That is actually going to be sort of the divine way of experiencing the world, according to the Epicureans. To not make your happiness contingent on what's going to happen at some future time, but to be happy right now. Okay, Nussbaum also talks about Furley's claims here, and I haven't read that article, but I'll tell you what she says about it. She says that, according to Furley, death makes empty and vain our current hopes and projects. Right? We have hopes, we have projects, and death makes them empty and vain. So this is a bit broader than just desires, right? I have hopes, I have projects, there are things I'm engaged in. Death makes them empty and vain. And Nussbaum, again, doesn't disagree, but she wants to push it a little bit further. And her way to push it further is to say this. She says, look, almost everything that for us human beings are like the really valuable activities and relationships have a particular shape in time. Namely, they are temporally extended. Right? One of the things that is valuable to me is, let's say, me being a father to my children. Well, being a father to your children is not something that occurs in a moment, right? It's not that, oh yeah, I mean, at the moment of conception, you're a father and that's the valuable thing. That's not the valuable thing. The valuable thing is something that extends over years and even decades. And it's a sort of thing that you are engaged in for this long, long period. And its temporal structure is essential to what it is and how it works and why it's valuable, right? Being a father is not something you do in a moment. It is something that always already has a past, like all the interactions I've had with my kids, all the decisions I've made about them, all the ways I've interacted with them, the pleasure they've given me, the non-pleasure they've given me. All of that is sort of part of a past that is crucial to me being a father at the moment. And all the things I'm going to do and planning to do and hoping for and so on are also crucial. This relationship is important to me and it's stretched out in time. The same is true for a romantic relationship. The same is true for a friendship. The same is true for being a son or daughter or mother, of course, and so on. The same is true for being a philosopher, for instance. Right? I mean, I'm making a video right now. Well, it's part of a much bigger trajectory that I'm on. And also, I hope that you are on. Right? I mean, you're not just watching this video for its momentary pleasure. Like, oh, wow, I mean, just seeing the face of that Gijsbers guy and hearing his voice, it's bliss itself. It is bliss itself. But that's not the whole point, right? I mean, you're watching this video in order to get maybe a little bit more enlightened, or at least think for yourself about questions having to do with mortality, immortality, life and death, and so on and so forth. And that's past and future looking, right? There is a temporal structure there. So, think about something like, well, recall the banquet argument, right? When nature tells us, in this story by Lucretius, life is like a banquet, there might be a sort of natural endpoint. Well, says Nussbaum, almost everything we're engaged in is always going to be future-looking. All the things that are really valuable to us are still extending into the future. Death almost always comes too early. Right? Maybe there could be a point in life when all that has sort of stopped and you're not future-looking anymore, but almost no real life is going to end at that point. So the banquet argument actually doesn't really work in favor of Lucretius, it works against him. Right? We're almost always taken away from the banquet halfway through, well, something, but certainly not after we've had the final cup of coffee and little bonbon. So that's Nussbaum's counter-argument against Lucretius. Right? All the things that we really value have this structure of temporal extension, which is future-looking, and therefore gives us a really good reason to fear death and believe that death would be something bad for us. Okay, what can Epicurus say against this? Well, what they're going to say is that these values are false values, right? Instead, what we should really value are things that the gods, in a sense, might value. Things that have nothing to do with our with this mortal existence, where we are hoping for certain things to happen and be the case, and us being allowed to do them, being in a position to do them in the future. We should embrace like these moments of bliss that are complete in themselves. Okay, says Nussbaum, this is where the story of trying to become like gods and trying to live a life according to nature just go in completely different directions. Right? You could maybe perhaps follow Epicurus and Lucretius and say, okay, I'm gonna sort of really base my life on enjoying these momentary, self-complete pleasures. Or you could embrace our normal values, you could say, all these loves and hopes and so on that we have, which are always future-looking. You can't do both. And it's the second, right, embracing these mortal values, that is a continuation of who we already are. Whereas the Epicurean suggestion would be a complete change in who we are. Like a complete reconceptualization and re-evaluation of the world. An enormous revision. Why would we want to do that? Okay, says Nussbaum. The most important argument we get from Lucretius about why we would want to do that, why we would drop our normal mortal values and projects and hopes and loves, is that somehow they are self-defeating. And Lucretius likes to give examples of that. Okay, so he says, suppose that you are an erotic lover, right? An erotic lover is not somebody who thinks about porn all the time. It's somebody who is into, like, the love that couples have for each other, right? Not the love of a father to a child or a friend to a friend, but like romantic love, we might also call it. And Lucretius' conception here is that the erotic lover wants to find complete unity with the beloved. And he says, well, that's impossible. And so it's going to be constant frustration. So that's a kind of self-defeating wish. Or let's think about staying in the same direction. let's think about pleasures like eating or sex. What's going on? Well, in eating and sex, I mean, there's something that you want, right? You want food, you want sex, you get it, you're fulfilled. But then, just a little bit later maybe, the urge returns. And so Lucretius likens this to Sisyphus, the mythological figure who has to roll a stone up a hill, and every time he's almost at the top, the stone rolls down again. Right? I mean, that's what, like, you're hungry, you eat, you think, now I'm satisfied, and a couple of hours later, BAM! The stone goes down, you're hungry again. You think, I really want some sexual pleasure, you have it, you are satisfied, and a couple of hours or days or whatever later, the stone rolls down again, and you want it again. Horrible, Lucretius is telling us. That's terrible. You don't want that, right? I mean, you want to get rid of those types of desire and desire only things that are completely fulfilling. Well, says Nussbaum, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Sure, if what you want is complete unity with the beloved, then as an erotic lover you have a problem. But that's not usually what we want out of relationships. What we want out of relationships is sort of loving interaction, getting to know each other better, spending time together, doing things, growing in our love, and so on and so forth. Nothing problematic about that, right? That's not self-defeating, that is worthwhile. Think about food and sex. Nobody wants to eat a meal such that you'll never be hungry again, because, eating itself is fun. Nobody wants to have sex in such a way that you'll never have the sexual urge again. I mean, you actually want at a certain point to no longer be satisfied, so you can again engage in this pleasurable activity. So Lucretius' attempt to show us that our normal desires and projects are self-defeating, it doesn't work. Right? We actually value those projects, and one of the things we value about them is that they are ongoing or returning. That's one of the valuable things about them. Okay, so this Epicurean argument doesn't really seem to work. In fact, Lucretius is at his best when he is picturing people who sort of live in a world of constant change, and they try to stop the change. Right? They try to get in a position where they are completely satisfied with something forever. Well, that doesn't work. I mean, that's not the structure of mortality. That is not the structure of our lives in time. Yes, says Nussbaum, but it doesn't follow that you have to become a god. It could follow that you have to stop trying to immobilize things, that you should just embrace instead your mortality, the change that it brings, the fact that it also always means going on, having to strive for something else, getting a new desire, a new project, a new love, and so on and so on. So, our values, Nussbaum is claiming in the end, our values are mortal values. And we don't even really know what it would be like to drop all of that and embrace instead this immortal value where you kind of live as if there's no death, as if time is unimportant. And she says, well, the best clue we have to what would happen is we can read the stories of Homer and check out his gods. And his gods are, well, they're fairly strange beings. Like for them, life isn't fully serious. Right? Because they are immortal, because they have all the time in the world, because everything is going to happen to them again and again, I suppose, they're not fully serious about anything. They have all these adventures. It's all a laugh. It's all a joke. They have rollicking good fun maybe, but they lack a kind of depth or seriousness, which is there only in a mortal life where things, happen maybe only once or a limited number of times. Here's Nussbaum, page 229. The intensity and dedication with which very many human activities are pursued cannot be explained without reference to the awareness that our opportunities are finite, that we cannot choose these activities indefinitely many times. What would it be like to sort of love someone and get into a relationship with them, if you are immortal and you know that you're going to get into relationships with basically everyone at some point, what is it like to sort of really put time into something if you have all the time in the world? We don't really know. All we know is that it would be very different from what it is like to do these things in the way that we human beings, we mortals, do them. And so, Nussbaum's conclusion is, we should embrace our mortality. And Lucretius and Epicurus at some point take a wrong turn when they try to turn us away from mortality and try to turn us into people who behave, for all intents and purposes, as if they are immortals and time is nothing to them.